Sarah had always believed in trust. It was the foundation of every relationship she built, the cornerstone of her marriage, the unshakable bond she thought she shared with her mother. But in a single moment, that belief shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. It started as an ordinary day. Sarah had been away on a 3-day business trip, a last-minute change in her company's quarterly planning that required her presence at a meeting in Boston. She hadn't planned to return until the evening, but after wrapping up her responsibilities earlier than expected, she decided to take an earlier flight home. The idea excited her. James, her husband, always appreciated surprises. She imagined walking into their house, seeing his face light up, and spending the rest of the afternoon together before he even expected her home. She didn't text him before leaving the airport. It was supposed to be a real surprise, the kind that rekindled excitement in a marriage that, if she was honest, had been feeling a little distant lately. Work had been stressful for both of them, and with Linda, her mother, spending more time at their house due to some vague personal issues she refused to elaborate on, their time alone had been limited. Sarah had suggested a weekend getaway, but James had brushed it off, saying he was too busy. She had ignored the gnawing feeling of rejection. It wasn't unusual for work to get in the way. Besides, James was a good husband. He had always been attentive, caring, supportive. At least that was what she told herself. The cab ride from the airport felt longer than usual, her anticipation growing with each passing mile. She thought about picking up something special on the way. A bottle of wine, maybe his favorite takeout, but she ultimately decided against it. She wanted to see the look on his face first. As she approached the house, a small frown crept onto her face. James's car was in the driveway, which wasn't surprising, but so was Linda's. That was a little odd. Her mother hadn't mentioned coming over today. Then again, Linda had a tendency to drop by unannounced, always offering some excuse about how lonely she was since Sarah's father had passed away. Shaking off her mild confusion, Sarah unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house was unusually quiet. Normally, if James knew someone was home, he would have music playing in the background or the TV on. Instead, there was only silence. She took a few steps in, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. "James?" she called out, expecting to hear his voice from somewhere upstairs. No response. She moved further in, placing her bag on the kitchen counter. A half-empty wine glass sat by the sink, lipstick smudged along its rim. The sight made her stomach tighten with unease. It wasn't her shade. Sarah slowly made her way toward the staircase, her heart beginning to pound. As she reached the second floor, faint sounds drifted from the bedroom. Muffled voices. A soft laugh, her mother's laugh. Something was wrong. She pushed the bedroom door open, and there they were. For a moment her brain refused to process what she was seeing. James, her James, was tangled in the sheets with another woman. But it wasn't just any woman. It was Linda, her mother. The world tilted. Sarah felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Her legs locked in place, her arms hung limply at her sides. She couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't breathe. James was the first to notice her. His eyes widened in horror as he scrambled to grab the sheets, fumbling for an explanation that wouldn't come. "Sarah." Linda turned, gasping as she clutched the blanket to her chest. "Oh my God," she whispered. Sarah's stomach twisted so violently she thought she might be sick. The walls of her bedroom, the bedroom she shared with her husband, felt like they were closing in. "Sarah, listen," James started, his voice shaking. "I can explain." "Explain?" Sarah finally found her voice, though it felt foreign coming out of her throat. It was hollow, distant, like it belonged to someone else. "Explain what, James? That you're sleeping with my mother?" Her voice cracked on the last word, the weight of the betrayal crashing down on her. Linda opened her mouth, tears already forming in her eyes. "Sweetheart, Go." Sarah's tone was sharp enough to cut. "Don't you dare." Tears burned behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not yet. Not in front of them. She needed to get out of there, needed to breathe, needed to think. She turned on her heel and walked out. James was calling her name, but she didn't stop. She descended the stairs 2 at a time, grabbed her bag from the counter and stepped outside. The air was cool, but she barely felt it. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Rage, betrayal, disbelief. She got into her car, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she had to leave. As she pulled out of the driveway, the first tear finally slipped down her cheek. And then another. Until suddenly, she was sobbing so hard she had to pull over to the side of the road. Everything she had believed in, everything she had trusted was a lie. The city blurred past as Sarah drove aimlessly, her hands gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing anchoring her to reality. She wasn't sure how long she'd been driving. Maybe minutes, maybe hours. Her mind was a storm of emotions too chaotic to make sense of. Her husband, her mother, the two people she trusted most in the world. She had seen betrayal before. Friends who whispered behind each other's backs. Coworkers who threw colleagues under the bus to get ahead. But this was beyond anything she had ever imagined. It wasn't just infidelity. It was a violation of something deeper, something sacred. She pulled into the parking lot of a bar on the outskirts of town. It was one of those dimly lit, rundown places that people went to when they wanted to disappear. Perfect. She parked haphazardly and walked inside, her heels clicking against the worn wooden floor. The bartender barely glanced at her as she slid onto a stool. "Whiskey." "Neat," she muttered, her voice hoarse from holding back tears. A glass was placed in front of her without a word. She took a sip, the burn in her throat a welcome distraction from the ache in her chest. The seat next to her shifted. Someone had sat down. "Didn't peg you for the whiskey type." Sarah turned her head and found herself staring into a familiar pair of dark eyes. Victor. She hadn't seen him in years. They had been friends once, back when she was fresh out of college before she met James. Victor had always been the dangerous type. The kind of man people whispered about in low voices. He was successful, wealthy, but no one really knew what he did. There were rumors, of course, that he had his hands in things that weren't exactly legal, that he made people's problems disappear. Sarah had never asked. Some things were better left unknown. She let out a humorless laugh. "And what type did you peg me for?" Victor smirked, taking a sip of his own drink. "White wine, maybe a cocktail if you're feeling adventurous. But whiskey, that means something bad happened." His eyes flickered over her face. "Judging by the look in your eyes, I'd say it's something really bad." Sarah scoffed, shaking her head. "That obvious, huh?" He didn't answer, just waited. She wasn't sure why she told him. Maybe it was the alcohol. Maybe it was the fact that he was the only person in the world right now who didn't look at her with pity. But before she knew it, the whole story spilled out. The early flight, the lipstick on the wine glass, the betrayal in her own home. Victor listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When she finally finished, she let out a shaky breath. "I want to ruin them," she said, the words surprising even herself. "I don't just want to walk away and pretend this never happened. I want them to suffer. I want them to lose everything." Victor studied her for a long moment, before placing his glass down. "Revenge is a tricky thing, Sarah. It feels good at first, but it has a way of getting messy. I don't care." He leaned back, his fingers tapping against the bar. "All right. Let's say I help you. What exactly are you asking for?" Sarah hesitated. She hadn't thought this far ahead. She just knew she couldn't let them get away with it. "I want them exposed," she said finally. "I want everyone to know what they did. I want James to lose his job, his reputation. I want my mother to be humiliated. And I want to do it in a way that they never see coming." Victor's lips curled into a small, amused smile. "Now that I can do." A shiver ran down Sarah's spine. She had always known Victor was capable of things most people weren't. But now, sitting here making a deal with him, she was beginning to understand just how dangerous he really was. "Of course," he continued, swirling the last of his drink in his glass, "this isn't a favor. If I do this for you, you'll owe me." Sarah swallowed. "Oh, you what?" "I don't know yet," Victor admitted. "But when the time comes, I'll ask. And you'll say yes." She should have hesitated, should have considered what she was getting herself into. But all she could think about was the image of James and Linda together. The way they had looked at her like she was the intruder in her own life. "Deal," she said, the word barely more than a whisper. Victor's smile widened. He lifted his glass in a mock toast before finishing his drink. "Then let's get started." Sarah never thought she would be the kind of person to seek revenge. A few weeks ago, she would have laughed at the idea. She had always believed in taking the high road, in being the better person. But betrayal had a way of eroding principles, of turning even the most rational person into someone they barely recognized. She had made a deal with Victor, and there was no turning back. The first step was information. Victor's network of contacts worked quickly, uncovering details Sarah had never known about her own husband. James had been careful. He had to be, considering his position as a respected financial consultant. But no one was perfect. His affair with Linda wasn't the only secret he had been keeping. There were discrepancies in his firm's financial records, hidden accounts that suggested embezzlement. Nothing concrete enough to put him behind bars just yet. But it was enough to create a scandal. "Your husband is a thief," Victor told her over coffee one morning, sliding a folder across the table. A sloppy one, but a thief nonetheless. Sarah opened the folder with shaking hands. It was all their transfers, falsified reports, shady investments. "How did you get this?" she asked, not sure she wanted to know the answer. Victor smirked. "I have my ways." She exhaled, staring down at the evidence. This was it. The perfect way to bring James down. "What about Linda?" she asked, her voice colder than she expected. Victor took a sip of his coffee before answering. "Your mother has always cared about appearances. Her social standing, her image. She's built her whole life around the idea that she's an elegant, respectable woman. But imagine what happens when people see her for what she really is." Sarah's stomach twisted. Linda had always prided herself on being the perfect hostess, the woman everyone envied. The affair itself was enough to ruin her reputation. But Victor had gone further. He had compiled emails, text messages, even photos that showed just how manipulative Linda had been over the years. Affairs with married men, backstabbing her so-called friends, even lying about charity donations to make herself look better. "This will destroy her," Sarah whispered half to herself. Victor studied her carefully. "Isn't that what you want?" She hesitated. The answer should have been easy. But as much as she hated Linda, as much as the betrayal burned inside her, this was still her mother. "She didn't hesitate to destroy you," Victor reminded her. That was all it took. Any lingering guilt vanished. They put the plan into motion. The first domino to fall was James. Sarah leaked the financial documents anonymously to an investigative journalist, someone known for taking down corporate criminals. The story spread like wildfire, and within days, James was under investigation. His firm placed him on immediate leave. His clients pulled out of deals, and his reputation crumbled overnight. The man who had once been seen as a financial genius was now a disgraced fraud, scrambling to do damage control. Sarah watched from a distance, a cold satisfaction settling in her chest. Next was Linda. Victor arranged for the affair to be exposed in the most humiliating way possible. At a charity gala Linda had spent months organizing. Sarah didn't attend, but she heard about it the next morning. Photos of Linda and James together, along with messages proving just how long their affair had been going on, were anonymously sent to every guest at the event. The fallout was immediate. Linda became a social pariah overnight. Her so-called friends distanced themselves, horrified by the scandal. Some of them had suspected she was having an affair, but no one had imagined it was with her own daughter's husband. Sarah didn't reach out to her. She didn't need to. Linda called her dozens of times, left voicemails sobbing, begging for forgiveness, but Sarah deleted them all without listening. She had gotten what she wanted. James was ruined. Linda was disgraced. So why did she feel so empty? Sarah had thought that revenge would bring her peace. She had imagined that once James and Linda's lives were in ruins, she would feel lighter, freer. Instead, all she felt was a strange kind of emptiness, like a hollow space had opened inside her chest. James had tried to contact her at first. He had called, sent messages, even shown up at her office demanding to talk. But there was nothing left to say. His life was already falling apart. His career was over, his finances under investigation, and the house they had shared was up for sale. He had nowhere to go. Linda had been his last safety net, but she was too busy dealing with her own downfall to help him. Sarah had imagined feeling triumphant when she saw him so utterly broken. But instead, all she felt was exhaustion. Linda, on the other hand, had been desperate. The once poised woman, who had always controlled every aspect of her life, had crumbled completely. She had left Sarah countless voicemails, sobbing, begging for forgiveness, for a chance to explain. But Sarah had nothing left to say to her mother. She had gotten what she wanted. The people who had betrayed her had paid the price. So why did it feel like she had lost something too? She tried to go back to her normal life, but something had shifted inside her. The woman she had been before, the woman who believed in love, in trust, in family, no longer existed. She went through the motions of her days, but everything felt dull. And then Victor called. They met at the same bar where their deal had begun. He was already seated when she arrived, swirling a glass of whiskey between his fingers. "You look tired," he said as she slid into the seat across from him. Sarah let out a dry laugh. "You could say that." Victor studied her for a moment, then smirked. "You got what you wanted." She nodded. "I did. And..." She hesitated. "And I don't know what comes next." Victor took a sip of his drink. "That's the thing about revenge, Sarah. It doesn't fix anything. It just leaves you with a mess, and no idea what to do with yourself." She exhaled, running a hand through her hair. "So what now?" Victor leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "Now it's time to settle our deal." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. She had known this was coming, but she had forced herself not to think about it. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice steady. Victor tilted his head slightly, as if considering his words carefully. "I could ask for a lot of things," he said. "But I think you already know what I'm going to say." She did. From the moment she had made the deal, she had known that Victor wouldn't ask for money or favors. He would ask for something much bigger. "You want me to work for you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. His smile was slow, amused. "You're smart. You know how the world really works now. You're not the woman you were before all of this." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "And I think you're starting to realize that you don't want to be her again." Sarah's pulse pounded in her ears. A part of her wanted to say no, to walk away and try to rebuild her life. But another part of her, the part that had watched James and Linda burn without remorse, knew that she couldn't go back to the way things were. She wasn't the same person anymore. Victor saw it too. "What would I have to do?" she asked finally. He leaned back, satisfied. "You'll find out soon enough." Sarah stared at him for a long moment, then reached for the glass in front of her. And as she took a slow sip, she realized she wasn't afraid.